On a quiet Friday evening, Keanu Reeves stepped into Waitress, Le Chateau, an upscale fine dining restaurant known for its exclusivity and refined elegance. Nestled in the heart of Waitress, New York City, the restaurant exuded an air of sophistication, with dim golden lighting reflecting off crystal chandeliers and sleek marble floors. Each table was adorned with pristine white linens, flickering candlelight, and meticulously polished silverware, setting the perfect ambience for high-profile guests and elite socialites. Unlike the usual patrons who arrived in tailored Armani suits or designer evening gowns, Keanu entered in a relaxed, almost effortless manner. He wore a simple white button-down shirt, slightly creased from a long day, paired with well-worn denim jeans and scuffed leather loafers that had clearly seen better days. His tousled dark hair and laid-back demeanor stood in stark contrast to the polished and poised clientele who frequented the establishment. As he stepped through the grand entrance, the quiet hum of conversation slowed, and a few diners exchanged quick glances. Some whispered among themselves, their curious eyes narrowing slightly. "Is that?" one murmured to a companion. But Keanu's unassuming nature quickly dispelled any growing attention. To many, he could have easily been mistaken for a weary traveler stopping in for a meal or a regular guy who had wandered in by mistake. Despite the restaurant's reputation for exclusivity, Keanu made no grand gestures to announce himself. He didn't demand special treatment, nor did he attempt to garner attention. Instead, he simply approached the hostess stand, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, and his request straightforward. "A table for one, please." At the hostess stand, Anofi, a sharp-featured woman in her early 30s, stood with impeccable posture, her uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of Le Chateau, ensuring that only the most distinguished guests graced its elegantly arranged tables. As Keanu Reeves approached, she instinctively assessed him with a practiced eye, her polished smile faltering ever so slightly as she took in his attire. His white button-down shirt, though clean, was slightly wrinkled. His denim jeans, while in good condition, were far from the tailored slacks typically worn by the restaurant's elite patrons. Then there were his shoes, scuffed leather loafers that spoke of years of wear. A flicker of judgment crossed Sophie's face, though she quickly masked it behind a professional demeanor. "Not exactly our usual type," she thought. "Good evening," Keanu said, his voice deep and steady. "I'd like a table for one, please." Sophie's lips curved into a tight, practiced smile. "Of course, sir," she replied, her tone courteous but clipped. But behind her professional facade, her mind raced with assumptions. This man didn't fit the mold of their typical clientele. Executives, celebrities, and high-net-worth individuals who made reservations weeks in advance. He had no reservation, no entourage, no air of entitlement. To her, he didn't belong. She glanced discreetly at the seating chart, then at the tables in the center of the dining area, where chandeliers cast a warm, inviting glow over finely dressed guests sipping on glasses of $500 Bordeaux and indulging in $200 seafood towers. These prime spots were reserved for those who belonged. Instead of seating Keanu among them, she led him past the grandeur, through the softly lit expanse of the dining room, and toward a dimly lit corner near the kitchen doors. "This should be perfect for you," Sophie said with a polite but distant smile as she set the menu down a little too forcefully. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen echoed nearby, along with the faint aroma of sizzling steak and simmering sauces. The contrast between this tucked-away table and the lavishly arranged ones in the main dining area was unmistakable. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He glanced around, observing the ornate decor and the quiet hum of conversation. Then, with the same calm expression, he simply said, "Thank you." His voice carried no offense, no hint of discomfort. Sophie tilted her head slightly, her smile taking on an almost smug edge. Does he even realize he's being pushed aside? She wondered. "If you need help with the menu, let me know," she added, her tone just a little too sweet, laced with the subtle implication that he might be out of his depth. "Some of our dishes can be overwhelming for first-timers." Keanu looked up at her, his gaze steady but kind. "I'll be fine, thank you." he replied, opening the menu with quiet confidence. As Sophie walked away, she exchanged a glance with her coworker. Daniel, a younger server with a more open-minded approach to hospitality. Lowering her voice, she whispered, "Did you see him?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what about him?" Sophie smirked. "I bet he doesn't even know what kind of place he walked into. No reservation, dressed like that. This place is about presentation. We cater to a certain type of clientele." Daniel frowned slightly but chose his words carefully. "I don't know. He seems fine to me." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Trust me, by the end of the night, he'll regret stepping into Le Chateau." Back at his table, Keanu sat quietly, flipping through the menu with genuine curiosity. Unlike the usual guests who flaunted their wealth, he seemed to simply be enjoying the moment. Around him, a few diners cast discreet glances in his direction, whispering among themselves. At a nearby table, Richard, a silver-haired gentleman with an air of quiet sophistication, leaned toward his wife. "Olivia." "That's Sophie again," he murmured. "She always acts like the gatekeeper of this place." Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "It's a shame. He seems perfectly polite." As the whispers continued, one thing was clear. Whether Sophie realized it or not, her judgment of Keanu Reeves was about to become the most talked-about moment of the evening. As Keanu Reeves sat quietly at his table near the kitchen doors, flipping through the menu, the whispers around the restaurant grew louder. Despite the subtle stares and hushed conversations, he remained calm, his focus solely on deciding what to order. He didn't check his phone, didn't fidget, and didn't seem the least bit uncomfortable. His presence, though understated, carried a quiet confidence that some found intriguing, and others, like Sophie the hostess, found unsettling. At the hostess stand, Sophie stood with her arms crossed, still keeping a close watch on Keanu. Her polished smile had faded into something more calculating, her amusement evident. Next to her, Daniel, a younger server with a much kinder demeanor, noticed her expression and sighed. He had worked at Le Chateau for over a year and had seen Sophie's attitude toward guests she deemed unworthy play out time and time again. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, nudging Daniel. He glanced up from the reservation book. "Hear what?" She leaned in slightly, speaking just loud enough for only him to hear. "He ordered the Wagyu steak, the $400 one." She smirked, shaking her head in disbelief. "I bet he has no idea how much it costs." Daniel frowned, his patience with Sophie's attitude wearing thin. "Maybe he does," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Maybe he just wants to enjoy a good meal." Sophie rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by Daniel's optimism. "Come on, Daniel, look at him. No reservation, dressed like that," she said, gesturing toward Keanu with a flick of her hand. "This place isn't just about the food, it's about the experience. People come here to be seen. He doesn't belong." Daniel exhaled through his nose, suppressing the urge to argue further. He had learned that trying to change Sophie's mind was a losing battle. "I just think it's not our job to judge people," he said quietly, turning back to his work. Meanwhile, Keanu remained unfazed, calmly perusing the menu, occasionally glancing around the dining room, taking in the restaurant's elegant decor, the high ceilings, the soft golden lighting, the expertly arranged floral centerpieces. Everything about Le Chateau exuded luxury. He appreciated the effort that went into creating such an atmosphere, but it didn't intimidate him. At a nearby table, Richard and Olivia, the older, well-dressed couple, continued their quiet observations. Olivia, a woman with a keen eye for detail, studied Keanu for a moment before leaning toward her husband. "You know," she murmured, "he seems oddly familiar." Richard adjusted his glasses, turning his attention toward the man in the corner. "It's not just that he's familiar," he said thoughtfully. "It's his presence. He doesn't fit in here, but at the same time, he commands the room without even trying." Olivia nodded slowly. "You think Sophie realizes she's digging her own hole?" Richard chuckled softly. "Not yet, but she will." Back at the hostess stand, Sophie wasn't finished with her quiet ridicule. She continued watching Keanu, expecting some sign of discomfort, an anxious glance at the menu, a nervous check of his wallet, anything that would confirm her assumptions. But none came. Instead, Keanu sat there, relaxed as ever. When the bread basket arrived, a selection of artisanal sourdough and warm brioche rolls, he nodded in thanks to the server and took a piece, buttering it with deliberate ease. He seemed to be savoring the moment, rather than rushing through the meal. Sophie's irritation grew. Why wasn't he reacting the way she expected? Determined to get a reaction, she strode toward his table, carrying a glass of ice water, setting it down with a bit more force than necessary. The ice cubes clinked sharply against the glass. "Your steak will be out shortly," she said, her smile tight and artificial. Keanu looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm and steady. Sophie lingered for a moment, waiting, perhaps hoping that he would say something, maybe stammer out an awkward acknowledgement or express some sort of unease. But Keanu simply returned his attention to the dining room, taking in the ambiance, wholly unbothered. As Sophie walked away, her frustration mounted. Why isn't he flustered, she thought. Why isn't he second-guessing himself? Near the bar, Daniel was drying a set of wine glasses, watching the exchange with a quiet shake of his head. He had a feeling that this night was about to take an interesting turn, though he wasn't sure exactly how. At another table, a group of young professionals who had been dining on lobster bisque and filet mignon had also taken notice of the interaction. One of them, a woman in her late 20s, leaned toward her companion. "Do you think he's someone important?" she whispered. "He's so calm, it's almost unnerving." "I don't know," her friend replied, "but the way Sophie's treating him is making her look worse than him." By now, the tension in the restaurant had shifted. What had started as subtle glances and quiet whispers had turned into open curiosity. More and more diners were beginning to take notice of the man in the corner, the man who, without saying much at all, was commanding the attention of the entire room. Howard leaned toward Olivia once more, his smile growing. "This is going to be one for the books." Back at the hostess stand, Sophie muttered under her breath. "I don't get it," she said, more to herself than to Daniel. "Why isn't he uncomfortable?" Daniel, who had been watching the whole situation unfold, simply shrugged. "Maybe because he doesn't care what people think," he said. Sophie scowled. "Everyone cares what people think," Daniel smirked. "Not him." As the minutes ticked by, more staff members began to notice the unusual energy in the room. Even the kitchen staff, usually too busy to pay attention to the dining area, started peeking through the service window. Something was happening, even if no one could quite put their finger on what it was. Then finally the moment arrived. The doors to the kitchen swung open, and Victoria, the restaurant's general manager, stepped out. Unlike Sophie, Victoria carried herself with true authority, graceful, poised, and utterly professional. Her sharp eyes swept across the restaurant, scanning the room until they landed on the man in the corner. And then, in an instant, her expression changed. Recognition flickered across her face. She knew exactly who he was. Without hesitation, she began walking toward him. Sophie, still standing at the hostess stand, watched Victoria approach and stiffened. A sudden wave of unease washed over her. "What now?" she muttered, her fingers tightening around the edge of the podium. She had no idea that everything she had assumed about Keanu Reeves was about to come crashing down around her. A shift in the atmosphere at Le Chateau. As the evening unfolded, Le Chateau remained abuzz with quiet conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china, and the occasional pop of a champagne bottle being uncorked. The restaurant's usual clientele, wealthy business executives, celebrities, and well-dressed socialites, continued their meals, seemingly unaffected by the presence of the unassuming man seated near the kitchen. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing. Keanu Reeves, still seated in his dimly lit corner, appeared completely at ease. He had ordered the Wagyu steak, a $400 cut of beef known for its unparalleled marbling and melt-in-your-mouth texture. As he waited for his meal, he sipped from the ice water that Sophie, the hostess, had placed in front of him earlier, her expression a mix of forced politeness and thinly veiled disdain. Sophie, despite her best efforts to mask her feelings, was growing increasingly irritated. She had expected Keanu to falter, to show some sign of unease, perhaps to check his wallet anxiously upon hearing the price of his meal. But instead, he remained composed, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. At the nearby table, Richard and Olivia, the older, well-dressed couple, continued their quiet observations. Olivia sipped her Chateau Margaux, a $900 bottle of Bordeaux, her eyes flicking between Keanu and the staff members, who whispered among themselves. "You know," Olivia murmured, setting her glass down gently. "He seems oddly familiar." Richard adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, peering over at the man in the corner. "It's not just familiarity," he said thoughtfully. "It's his presence. He doesn't fit in here, yet at the same time, he commands the room without even trying." Olivia nodded slowly, following her husband's train of thought. "And Sophie," she added, glancing toward the hostess stand where Sophie stood whispering with another server. "Daniel is completely unaware that she's making a fool of herself." Richard chuckled softly. "She'll realize soon enough." Growing speculation among the diners. At another table near the center of the restaurant, a group of young professionals dressed in tailored suits and designer cocktail dresses had also taken notice. "Do you think he's someone important?" one of the women asked her companion, her voice just above a whisper. "He's so calm. It's almost unnerving." "I don't know," her friend replied, stirring his old-fashioned, the $45 cocktail served with a hand-cut ice cube and a twist of orange peel. "But the way Sophie's treating him is making her look worse than him." The murmurs grew as more diners picked up on the subtle tension unfolding in the restaurant. Some simply observed with mild curiosity, while others, like Richard and Olivia, sensed that something bigger was about to happen. Back at the hostess stand, Sophie's irritation only deepened. She had worked at Le Chateau long enough to know how the restaurant operated. Presentation was everything, and clients who belonged made it obvious. Keanu, with his relaxed demeanor and lack of designer labels, did not fit her perception of the ideal customer. She turned to Daniel, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't get it," she muttered. "Why isn't he uncomfortable?" Daniel, who had long since given up trying to reason with her, simply shrugged. "Maybe because he doesn't care what people think." Sophie scoffed. "Everyone cares what people think." Daniel smirked. "Not him." A moment of recognition. The tension in the room subtly shifted when Victoria, the restaurant's general manager, emerged from the kitchen. A woman in her late 40s with impeccable posture and an air of quiet authority, Victoria had spent years building Le Chateau into the exclusive dining establishment it was today. She rarely left her post in the back of the house during service unless something significant required her attention. As she stepped onto the floor, her sharp eyes swept across the restaurant, assessing the scene with practiced efficiency. Then she saw him, Keanu Reeves. For a split second, her professional demeanor cracked, her eyes widening in surprise. But she recovered quickly, smoothing out the front of her tailored blazer before making her way toward his table. Sophie, still stationed at the hostess stand, noticed Victoria's movement and immediately tensed. "What now?" she thought, her fingers tightening around the edges of her notepad. As Victoria approached, the hushed conversations around the restaurant faded into silence. Diners who had been whispering among themselves now watched with renewed interest. Their curiosity piqued. Stopping beside Keanu's table, Victoria's expression shifted from one of authority to genuine warmth. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice laced with respect, "it's such an honor to have you dining with us tonight." For a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Keanu looked up from his menu, his signature easygoing smile playing at his lips. "Victoria," he greeted, his voice low and calm. "It's good to see you." The whispers that followed were no longer speculative. They were filled with realization. "Did she just say Mr. Reeves?" one diner murmured. "As in, Keanu Reeves?" Another replied, eyes widening. "How did we not recognize him?" someone else whispered. Sophie, standing frozen at the hostess stand, felt her stomach drop. Keanu Reeves. The name echoed in her mind, the weight of her earlier judgment crashing down on her all at once. The very man she had dismissed, the customer she had quietly mocked, the person she had deemed unworthy of Le Chateau's exclusivity, was in fact one of the most beloved actors in the world. A humbling realization. Victoria, seemingly unaware of the ripple effect her words had caused, continued speaking to Keanu. "I wish we had known you were coming," she said earnestly. "We would have prepared something special." Keanu, ever gracious, simply shook his head. "Everything's perfect," he assured her. "Thank you." Victoria smiled before stepping back, giving him space to continue his meal. As she did, the restaurant slowly came back to life, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Richard leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile on his face. "I knew it," he murmured to Olivia. "That kind of composure, it's unmistakable." Olivia nodded, glancing toward Sophie, who still stood stiffly at the front of the restaurant, her face pale, her earlier confidence shattered. "And Sophie thought she was teaching him a lesson," she said quietly, shaking her head. But it was clear now, she was the one being taught. As Keanu continued his meal, unfazed by the revelation, Sophie felt the weight of every gaze in the restaurant. The judgment in the eyes of the diners was no longer directed at Keanu, it was directed at her. She had spent the evening trying to prove that he didn't belong, but now it was painfully obvious. She was the one who had been out of place all along. The weight of realization. As the final echoes of recognition rippled through Le Chateau, the air in the restaurant thickened with an unspoken tension. What had once been subtle whispers turned into a wave of murmurs, eyes darting between the A-list actor seated in the corner and the hostess Sophie, who now stood frozen at her podium, her confidence drained away like a deflating balloon. She had spent the last hour quietly undermining the man, who now sat at the center of everyone's admiration. The same man she had dismissed for his casual attire, seated near the kitchen in a dimly lit section, was now the singular focus of the room. Not because he demanded it, but because his presence commanded it. Keanu's calmness versus Sophie's embarrassment. Unlike Sophie, who was now visibly flustered, Keanu Reeves remained composed. He didn't smirk in satisfaction or revel in the fact that he had just proven everyone wrong. Instead, he picked up his fork and knife, cutting into his Wagyu steak, taking his time with each bite, savoring the flavors without a single sign of discomfort. At a nearby table, Richard and Olivia, the older, sophisticated couple, shared another glance. "He hasn't flinched once," Richard murmured, admiration growing in his voice. "You can tell he's someone who doesn't let things rattle him." Olivia nodded, her eyes flickering back toward Sophie. Meanwhile, she's doing everything she can to hold it together. And indeed, Sophie was unraveling. The weight of her mistake was crashing down on her, the judgment in the eyes of the other diners unmistakable. She could almost hear their thoughts. How could she treat someone like that? Did she really just dismiss Keanu Reeves? Talk about embarrassing. Sophie's grip on her notepad tightened as she felt her cheeks flush. "I have to fix this." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move, to act, to do something that might salvage what remained of her dignity. An attempt to save face. With carefully measured steps, Sophie made her way toward Keanu's table. The room was quieter now, as though everyone had anticipated this moment, waiting to see how she would react. As she approached, she adopted a polite, professional tone, one she hoped would mask her growing nervousness. "Mr. Reeves," she said, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after spending so much time assuming he was an outsider. "I just wanted to personally check on your meal. Is everything to your liking?" Keanu looked up, pausing mid-bite. His expression remained warm, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "Everything is great," he said simply. Sophie forced a smile. "That's wonderful," she said, shifting slightly on her feet. "And I'd like to personally apologize for earlier. I didn't realize who you were." The room, though hushed, seemed to collectively hold its breath. Keanu placed his utensils down gently, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the words hang in the air, as if weighing them carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice steady. "But you know, respect shouldn't depend on recognition." The words, though spoken with kindness, hit Sophie like a gut punch. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Because what could she say? She had built her entire attitude toward him based on the belief that he was unworthy of Le Chateau's standards. She had judged him based on his clothes, his quiet demeanor, and the fact that he didn't seem to fit the usual mold of their high-profile guests. And yet, here he was, proving that true class had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character. The moment that changed everything. As Sophie struggled to form a response, movement at the front of the restaurant caught her eye. Victoria, the general manager, had returned to the hostess stand, her sharp gaze scanning the restaurant before settling on Sophie. With a subtle motion, she gestured for her to step aside. Sophie swallowed hard, knowing she had no choice. Excusing herself quickly, she made her way back to the stand, her pulse quickening as she approached her boss. Victoria didn't raise her voice, nor did she need to. Her presence alone was enough to make Sophie's nerves fray further. "What exactly has been going on here tonight?" Victoria asked, her voice calm but firm. Sophie hesitated. I didn't know who he was," she admitted quietly. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "And you thought that justified treating him differently?" Sophie swallowed. "I didn't mean—" Victoria cut her off with a sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Sophie, this is Le Chateau. Every guest deserves to be treated with respect, whether they're a celebrity or a regular person walking in off the street." Sophie lowered her gaze. "I understand," she murmured. Victoria's expression softened slightly, but the authority in her voice remained. "You represent this restaurant. If you let personal judgment dictate how you treat people, then you don't belong at the front of the house." The words stung, but Sophie knew they were true. Keanu's final words. Meanwhile, back at his table, Keanu Reeves calmly finished his meal, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin before rising to his feet. His movement was smooth, unhurried, yet somehow held the quiet gravity of someone who had left an impact on the entire room. He didn't need to raise his voice, yet when he spoke, the entire restaurant fell into silence. "I came here tonight for a quiet dinner," he began, his tone measured. "I didn't expect to draw attention, nor did I intend to cause a scene. But what happened here tonight isn't just about me. It's about something much bigger." He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping across the diners, the staff, and finally landing back on Sophie. "Respect isn't something you give to someone based on what they wear, how they look, or how much money you think they have," he continued. "It's something you offer to every person, regardless of their circumstances. Not because they've earned it, but because they're human." A deep silence settled over the room. Even the servers, who had been discreetly observing from the back, stood frozen in place, absorbing his words. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. Keanu took a small step back, letting his final words settle. "Mistakes happen," he said. "What matters is what we learn from them." With that, he gave a slight nod, signaling that he was finished. And then from somewhere in the room, applause began. First it was Olivia, the elegant woman who had been watching all night. Then Richard joined in. Soon others followed, the young professionals at their table, the couple in the corner, even some of the servers. It wasn't a standing ovation, it wasn't overly dramatic, but it was genuine. Sophie stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Her face burned with shame, but beneath it, she felt something else. Hope. Because for the first time that evening, she saw not just Keanu Reeves, but the kind of person she wanted to be. And that was the real lesson of the night, and a lesson in humility. As the echoes of applause faded, the energy inside Le Chateau shifted. The restaurant, once filled with quiet murmurs and speculative glances, was now wrapped in an air of reflection. The lesson Keanu Reeves had just imparted wasn't simply about one moment. It was about an everyday choice. A choice to treat people with respect, regardless of appearances. Sophie stood motionless near the hostess stand, her mind racing. She had spent the evening convinced that she was upholding the restaurant's exclusivity, that she was maintaining its standards. But now as she watched Keanu return to his seat, the weight of her actions pressed down on her. She had misjudged him. And worse, she had done it so publicly that she could feel the stares of the diners, their silent criticism heavier than any reprimand Victoria, the restaurant's general manager, could give. A manager's intervention. Victoria, standing just a few feet away, remained composed, her arms crossed as she studied Sophie carefully. She had seen many employees come and go, and she knew the difference between those who learn from their mistakes and those who refuse to change. "Sophie," she said quietly, beckoning her to step aside. Sophie hesitated before following her boss toward a more private area near the bar. She swallowed hard, dreading what was coming next. Victoria exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Do you understand what went wrong tonight?" Sophie's fingers curled around the edges of her notepad, her pulse quickening. I judged him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I assumed he didn't belong," Victoria nodded. "And?" Sophie's face burned. "And I treated him differently. I made assumptions without knowing anything about him." Victoria let the silence hang between them for a moment before responding. "This restaurant is built on more than just fine dining and exclusivity, Sophie. It's built on hospitality. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same level of respect, whether they're a billionaire or someone just looking to treat themselves to a nice meal." Sophie nodded, her throat tight. "I'm not going to fire you," Victoria continued, her tone firm but not unkind. "But I need to know that you understand why this matters." Sophie met her gaze, humbled. "I do. I won't make this mistake again." Victoria studied her for another moment, then gave a small nod. "Good. Now take a deep breath and finish your shift with professionalism." A moment of redemption. Sophie turned back toward the restaurant floor, feeling the weight of her mistake, but also an unexpected relief. She wasn't being condemned. She was being given a chance to change, and for the first time that night, she intended to make it count. Keanu's final words are a lasting impact. As the atmosphere inside Le Chateau settled, the lesson of the evening remained palpable. The quiet hum of conversation had resumed, but the energy had changed. The diners who had once exchanged whispers about the casually dressed man in the corner were now reflecting on their own assumptions. Keanu Reeves, still as composed as ever, finished the last bite of his Wagyu steak, carefully setting his utensils down on the fine china plate. He reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip before rising from his seat. Unlike earlier, when his presence had been overlooked or dismissed, now every eye in the restaurant was subtly watching him. But Keanu didn't seek attention. He never had. He simply adjusted his jacket, smoothing out the sleeves before turning toward the restaurant staff. "I just want to say something before I go," he said, his voice calm, but carrying enough weight that the room naturally quieted. He glanced at the team of servers, bartenders, and hostesses, his gaze eventually settling on Sophie. She stiffened slightly but held his gaze, bracing herself. "This evening wasn't about me," Keanu began, his voice steady and thoughtful. "It was about all of us. Every day we make small choices. How we treat others, how we judge them, how we assume things based on what we see instead of what we know." A few guests shifted in their seats, the truth of his words sinking in. "I didn't come here tonight expecting anything special," he continued. "I didn't want to be recognized. I just wanted a quiet meal. But what happened here is something that happens all the time, everywhere. People are judged based on their clothes, their looks, their perceived status, and the truth is, respect shouldn't depend on any of those things." His eyes moved back to Sophie, not with anger, but with something even heavier, understanding. "Mistakes happen," Keanu said. "What matters is how we learn from them." Sophie swallowed hard, feeling a mix of shame and gratitude. He wasn't here to embarrass her, he was here to teach. Keanu turned toward the rest of the staff. "This restaurant is beautiful, not because of its chandeliers, its wine list, or its exclusivity, but because of the people who work here. You have the power to make every guest feel welcome, no matter who they are. And that's something more valuable than any high-priced dish or five-star review." For a moment, the restaurant remained silent. Then a soft clap broke through the stillness. Olivia, the refined older woman, had started it. Soon Richard joined, then more guests, until the quiet applause rippled through the room. Keanu gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then turned back to the staff. "Take care of each other. That's what really matters." With that, he gave a final nod and made his way toward the exit. The lesson he left behind, however, would stay far longer than he would. As the evening wound down, the energy in Le Chateau had shifted significantly. The once whispered judgments and stares had transformed into an air of quiet reflection. Keanu Reeves had left a lasting impression, not through dramatic gestures, but with his calm demeanor and his thoughtful words. The staff, particularly Sophie, who had been the focal point of much of the evening's tension, now stood in a reflective silence. The applause that had greeted Keanu's brief speech had given way to an introspective quiet. Sophie, still processing the weight of the moment, felt a flicker of both shame and resolve. She had been given a chance to grow, to learn from her mistake, and she wasn't about to waste it. Her earlier arrogance had been replaced with humility, and though the experience had been uncomfortable, it was exactly the kind of wake-up call she needed. She glanced around at the other staff members, noting the subtle but undeniable shift in their demeanor. The lesson wasn't just for her, it had been a reminder for everyone present about the importance of treating each guest with respect, regardless of how they appeared. At the bar, Lucas Orm, a quieter, more patient server, caught her eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. His respect for Keanu had never wavered, and now as he saw Sophie slowly processing her own actions, he nodded in silent support. Sophie returned the gesture, her shoulders a little less tense, her steps a little more certain as she moved back into her role. The night ended with a new sense of purpose. As the last of the diners finished their decadent desserts, including a rich orange lemon tart and velvety chocolate souffle, the staff silently pledged to do better, starting with the very next guest. As the final diners began to filter out of Waitress Le Chateau, the restaurant's atmosphere had undergone a complete transformation. What had started as an evening filled with judgment, assumptions, and discomfort had shifted into one of quiet reflection and growth. Sophie, now fully aware of her misjudgment, felt a sense of resolve settle in. Though embarrassed by her actions, she was grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow. Outside, the night air felt cooler as the city of New York settled into its late-night rhythm. The bright lights of the city illuminated the streets, casting a soft glow on the sidewalks. Keanu Reeves, his jacket lightly adjusted, walked down the street with an unhurried pace reflecting on the evening's events. His calm demeanor had not only allowed him to enjoy a peaceful meal, but had inadvertently sparked a change in everyone who had witnessed the night unfold. He had taught them a lesson about humility, respect, and the power of simple actions. Back inside, Victoria, the manager, gathered the staff for a final word. Tonight wasn't just about a famous guest, she said quietly. It was about the importance of how we treat people every day. Let's carry that lesson forward. The team nodded in agreement, ready to be better, to treat everyone with the respect they deserved.